And as you can see, my topic, I'm just going right into the paper presentation, is on glocalizing the film musical in the Americas. I'm going to speak on intercultural and cross-media perspectives, and I'm actually, since we have limited time here, I'm actually not going all too much into all the intermedia and cross-media relations, but the intercultural component is the most important thing I'm going to talk about. And according to the main theme of the conference, the role of artistic expression in intercultural relations, I will deal with Latin American film musicals and their relations to the US media industry between the 1930s and the 1950s. So this is a bit more of a historical perspective I'm going to provide you with here. And you already, as I have seen from the program, had some insights or will have some insights into more contemporary audiovisual productions, especially digital media. So this will be a complementary paper here. And the film musicals, such as the Argentinian Cine Tanguero, the Brazilian Chanchada, and the Mexican Comedia Ranchera, were interrelated across regions, national frontiers, and cultures, exhibiting both localizing and globalizing representational regimes. Latin American musicals reflect the negotiation of cultural and generic identities vis-a-vis modernization, globalizing modernization processes. So actually, one of the main points here is that in film productions and music productions, even in the 30s and 40s and 50s, there was a very strong process of globalization, very strong process of intercultural and also economic interrelations between the different national cinemas in the Americas. That's something that is not always considered closely. And as sites of conflicting discourses and representations, these musicals draw on tango, samba, and ranchera performances as specific constructions of national identities. And at the same time, they do make use of generic patterns stemming from Hollywood cinema, such as, for example, backstage musicals or also singing cowboy films. And evidently, film productions are not only cultural artifacts, but also, and prominently, commercial commodities. Indeed, international marketability is a distinctive factor in the representational strategies of Latin American musicals. All three musical subgenres mentioned abide representational regimes that foreground often exoticized regional folklore, or in Graham Huggins' term, post-colonial exotic, that is, subject to the global commodification of cultural difference. The self-exoticizing representation of cultural difference implies a nation-building function for the domestic audiences, and at the same time serves as a marker of product differentiation in Latin American film market, which was strongly dominated by Hollywood productions already in the 20s. As I aim to show, despite the emphasis on cultural difference, the auto-exoticized self as other is ultimately relayed back to the same, especially by drawing to and altering. That's a main point here, because it's not about copying these generic patterns, but actually about creatively altering them. So especially drawing to and altering something which has been popularized by Hollywood musical genre. The musical genre, including also Hispanophone productions, since the globalization of cinema with the advent of sound led to a lot of Hispanic productions. There were also the so-called foreign language version films, and the Spanish or Hispanic productions were actually the main output of these films produced in Spanish in Hollywood cinema. And Latin American singer stars, such as the Argentinian Carlos Gardel, you all know him as the main tango star, and also Mexican Jose Mojica for example, who also was very famous even as an opera singer at the time, but also singing a lot of popular Mexican tunes and being very successful with it. And these two stars, singer-actor stars, for example, they were among the few who actually starred in films in Spanish language produced in Hollywood that were really successful. And the interesting thing is that these films made in Hollywood, they actually fostered also the development of sound film industries in Latin America, especially in Argentina and Mexico, the two main cinemas in the 20s until even present time. Nowadays, of course, Brazil is one of the main cinemas as well, but in the 30s it was rather still one of the minor cinemas there. And the cinematic flows between musicals in the Americas include not only the things I've mentioned, that is appropriations of generic structures popularized by Hollywood cinema, and regional cultural practices such as tango, samba, ranchera, I mentioned, but also a lot of other interconnections. These inter-American cinematic flows, they also exhibit what Arjun Appadurai, you probably have heard of him even in this conference, one of the main theoreticians of globalization, has called, and I quote, complex, overlapping, disjunctive order, which is one of the characteristics of globalization, is a definition that is very much cited as well. And this complex, overlapping, disjunctive order also is evident in, for example, the circulation of film stars and other film personnel from one national musical subgenre to another. Also transmedia synergies between film and music industries. All of these actor, singer stars, for example, Jorge Negrete and Amanda Ledesma, and I'm actually going into this a bit more afterwards, but all these big singer-actor stars, they actually, of course, were very successful in music industry and in film industry, and there's a lot of even vertical and horizontal interconnections between these cultural productions. And then also there were a lot of political interventions, even from governments, corporations, and lobbies as well, and economic and technological interrelations between the respective culture industries. If any questions might come up while I'm talking, so please don't hesitate to let me know, so I can, of course, clarify things that might not be so clear. Okay. The cinematic flows, okay, because of the limited time, because I've already mentioned that there are, of course, three main musical subgenres in Latin American cinema, and I'm going to repeat this quickly. It's the chanchada from Brazil, it's the comedia ranchera from Mexico, and it's the cine tanguero from Argentina. And of course, I won't be able to, in these 20 minutes I have for the paper, I won't be able to really dwell on all of this, so I won't be able to conduct a polycentric approach, which I usually favor, a polycentric approach that really enables to make all these interconnections clear on many levels, on aesthetic level, on political and economic levels as well. So I'm just gonna here draw to the example of interrelations, or mainly draw to the example of interrelations between US culture industry and Mexican film industry, and I'm gonna actually focus mainly on two of the most known genres, of the most popular genres, which is the Western in the Hollywood productions, and more specifically, actually, I've already mentioned it, the singing cowboy film, which is a musical version of the Western, and also the already mentioned comedia ranchera, which was also called El Cine Mexicano por Excelencia by Jorge Ayala Blanco, because it was really the main output of actually genre cinema from the 30s to the 50s, but also it probably is the genre that most perfectly also expresses a specific construction of Mexican cultural identity based on the national figure of the charro and the china poblana, and of course a lot of folklorized traditions, mainly from Jalisco, and they actually came to be similar to the cowboy figure, became actually symbols of Mexicanidad, or Mexican cultural identity. Okay, and I'm actually going to, according to Michael Curtin, talk about three main aspects here concerning the media capital at work in these cultural productions. And specifically, they are the logics of accumulation, and I'm following Michael Curtin here. Also, the forces of socio-cultural variation, and finally, trajectories of creative migration. And this is actually an aspect I will mainly focus upon, and including not only personnel, as Curtin has it, but also, and in particular, generic patterns and also their cultural matrices. So these are the main points I'm going to focus on. In both the Western and the Commedia Ranchera have shaped national imaginaries to a degree that they appear to be quintessentially US American or Mexican, respectively. The figure of the cowboy seems to be the epitome of Americanness. Since the late 19th century, foundational fictions in different media, such as literature, painting, and subsequently film, constructed a national myth around the figure of the cowboy going west. Nation and narration coincide, and this is a little phrase I borrowed from Homi Bhabha, who theorized the construction of national identities. So nation and narration coincide in many cowboy narratives that often, at least implicitly, depict the conquest of the American West. An exemplary representation of such a national myth can be found, for example, in The Virginian, Owen Wister's novel published in 1902, as well as various film adaptations of the same name. Most prominently, the sound version film starring Gary Cooper, Victor Fleming's The Virginian. And Gary Cooper programmatically proclaims in this film to make more United States out of raw prairie land. So this is a quote from the film. And associated both with the concept of frontier and regeneration through violence, the figure of the cowboy stands at the core of a mythical foundation of the United States of America as a nation. Or rather, as Benedict Anderson has called it, as an imagined community, established, enabled, and sustained not only by print capitalism, as Anderson has it, but also by modern mass media and especially film. Hollywood played a central role in the global dissemination of the imaginary of the cowboy via Western production. As the richest and most enduring, there are some problems. In our department, usually the whole beamer just breaks down when we have conferences, so this is nothing. And I might just, do you want me to just continue, or I can just have a break? Are there any questions? We might use this little break to, yes, please. Yeah, thank you. It is an exaggerated cultural identity, and of course, exoticization was a representational strategy in colonial discourse, and especially concerning indigenous people in the Americas, African people in the Americas as well, in the context here of Latin American cinema. And actually, it usually was quite derogatory. But, and here I agree, the self-exoticization does not necessarily has to be something completely positive or negative, because there are different forms of self-exoticization. For example, Carmen Miranda, which is one of the often cited examples of this kind of auto-exoticization and exoticization in musical productions in Hollywood. I mean, most of you might have the image of her as a really icon of popular culture in your head, because she had all these tropical fruits on her head, and she was really sexualized as well, and she was called the Brazilian bombshell, actually, and she was one of the main stars in Hollywood musicals in the 1940s. And there's some, I find, very convincing interpretations of her of actually being subversive in a way, because it is so over-exaggerated what she performs as Brazilian or even Latin American cultural identity, because a lot of folklorized traits are actually mixed there, but this could even be read as something subversive in a way. On the other hand, of course, it's something very repressive too, because there is something that could be called, in terms of feminist film theory, as the male gaze, which Laura Mulvey termed the phrase, and which is, of course, very, very strong in the representation of Carmen Miranda. But this would just be one of the examples. But what I would argue is that one really has to have a close reading of the particular form of exotization and auto-exoticization, because and this is one of my main points, reading genres as sites of conflict in discourses, they're actually very different forms of representation there, different representational regimes at work. And so I wouldn't definitely want to generalize this in terms of being either subversive or in terms of a negative connoted alterity.
The other point,
Can you all? I think the room is small enough to.
No.
Yeah.
The other point I was going to ask you about is, in much of this theoretical literature, like Said, Apatow, Spivak, and so on, what I find missing is the idea of play. And what you're talking about, this auto-exoticism and exoticism in general, can also be seen as an aspect of play.
Of course.
And there is not much focus on this part of what is happening when people play these kinds of roles and so on.
I'm not so sure, because, for example, Homi Bhabha, who is one of the main theoricians of post-colonial discourse, he is very much in the vein of course, post-structuralist thinking. It's actually all about ambivalence. So I would actually not necessarily agree that this notion of play is missing there. And also, because I think we should not really discuss post-colonial theory here, because I'm not discussing post-colonial theory in my paper, and I don't really want to put the theory on first place. And I'm actually going to draw to a lot of positions. I'm not, this is not a post-colonial focus I'm presenting. And I'm really interested at looking at the global cultural economy, actually, and looking at the different aspects of the auto-exoticization. And also, this is not all there is to it, because I'm not only going to talk about
okay, then why don't you just continue?
Yeah, but many things I would love to. It's very interesting questions, actually, and I would love to go more into it maybe at the coffee break, but I think this leads to a very specific discussion that won't give me any time to finish or to continue the paper here. I'm not sure, how are we about time? Is there a strong time limit, so I just know that I might skip some parts? And Oh, okay.
I mean, with questions if you come and
Yeah.
and I would only have to send them the element and then we can go.
Okay.
Question.
Okay, but we can do this quite flexibly, and I really appreciate your question. And if any other questions come up, please don't hesitate to ask me. It's actually pretty good, I think, to have it a bit more in a dialogic manner, this paper. So please, if any questions come up, let me know. Okay, but as I said, Hollywood played a central role in the global dissemination of the imaginary of the cowboy via Western productions. And as the richest and most enduring of Hollywood's repertoire from the classical studio system, that is, the Western evolved coevally with American cinema, marking the beginning of commercial, and this is a quote by Thomas Schetz, who's one of the authorities on genre cinema, actually Hollywood genre cinema, and he says, beginning of commercial narrative film in America and serving as the prototype for the studio system. So this is really a very central role of the Western genre there. And the genre was one of the most coveted American cultural imports around the world. Its popularity helped to establish the global predominance of American cinema via, and now I quote Raphaël Moine, who's a theorist in genre from France, actually, from Nanterre, and she says that via a genre, this is a quote, whose visual elements, semantics, and meaning were intimately tied to American history, its landscape, and its ideology. End of quote. And undoubtedly, the Western ranks high among culture productions most readily associated with the US and Americanism also. As you might know, there was predominantly in the 70s a strong discourse on cultural imperialism, and actually there was this frequent claim that actually imperialism, that even there was the claim that the Monroe Doctrine was prolonged by Western production. So this, that the actual imperialist politics of the US was actually had its counterpart, so to say, in the Western productions. And I think this is actually, in part, you might find some Western productions where you could say, oh, this is actually true. Maybe the film I already mentioned, where Gary Cooper claims to make more United States out of raw prairie land. But then a lot of films actually don't fit to this at all, and especially the already mentioned singing cowboy films. And interestingly, in these singing cowboy films, there's a lot of critical reflection on modernity and also on class consciousness, actually. I mean, I'm not going into this here because we don't have the time, but I just want to make the point that here again, it's actually a contested site, and that especially this subgenre has quite some almost even subversive aspects to it. And there was even a female singing cowboy, but unfortunately the film was not successful at all. So this figure was not actually developed into one of the main figures. So it was still dominated by male. And of course, the Western, just as the Commedia Ranchera, are genres that were really, in terms of gendering of genres, were really helping to shape a masculinist national identity, both for the US and, of course, for Mexico. But this is just something I want to mention apart. I mean, we could go into, actually, if you're interested in one of these aspects, we could go into it. If not, or you might just ask at the end of the little paper. And although appearing to be quintessentially US American, the cowboy as an emblem of the nation is an invented tradition. I'm using here the term, you all probably know it from Eric Hobsbawm, an invented tradition in the sense of attempting, and now I quote Hobsbawm, in the sense of attempting to establish continuity with a suitable past. This is Eric Hobsbawm, the famous notion on the invention of tradition, and which actually does not trace back to genuine American origins. And as a side, I want to clarify this too. Of course, there is no such thing as a single origin of any culture. This essentialist notion is, to my opinion, and of course to the opinion of most people who work in cultural studies, is just very misleading. In this regard, I would want to just quickly cite Edward W. Said, whom you all know probably, who has pointed out in Culture and Imperialism, and this book has pointed out, and I quote this, "All cultures are involved in one another. None is single and pure. All are hybrid, heterogeneous, extraordinarily differentiated, and unmonolithic," unquote. So this is a main statement by Said about cultures not having an essence, but rather developing in interconnections with each other. Far from being originally American, nor even stemming from white Anglo-Saxon Protestant traditions, as often has been claimed, the cowboy in fact evolved from a Mexican predecessor. In a thorough comparative study, Cowboys of the Americas, Richard W. Slater states, and I quote this, "Much of the dress, language, equipment, and values of the Mexican and California vaquero passed to the Anglo-American cowboy," unquote. And in Nueva España, today's Mexico, and much of US territory, colonial landowners perpetuated the legacy of Spanish caballeros, or gentlemen, in sharp contrast to the status of their employees, the vaqueros, or working class cowboys. So we have a very strong social hierarchy here. As it were, the allied equestrian culture of the charro developed from traditions cultivated by the wealthy landed caballeros and subsequent landowners, evident in the luxurious, adorned black dress and white shirt worn by the charro, which contrasts strongly with the clothing of the lower class vaqueros. Shortly after the consolidation of the Mexican Revolution around 1920, the charro quickly became a national symbol, not least as manifestation of, and I quote, "centralistic aspirations of the nation state and as an instrument of unification and homogenization of the national dispersion and plurality." And this is a quote by Tania Carreño King, who has pointed this out in her very thorough study called El Charro, la construcción de un estereotipo nacional, which is one of the most thorough studies on the cultural history of the charro. And cultural expressions like music and cinema especially were of utmost importance for the consolidation and the dissemination of the imaginary of the charro as a national symbol. When Carlos Rincón Gallardo published a paradigmatic book called El Charro Mexicano in 1939, his characteristic of the charro closely corresponded with the figure's representation in cinema. And Rincón Gallardo distinguishes the charro as noble, loyal, and brave, a man who is drawn to dangerous exercise, who loves beautiful women, horses, and pistols, and this is actually very telling for the whole genre, and has the habit to sing and dance. He concludes, and I quote this, "By tradition, he is the genuine national symbol," the charro is. And similar to the figure of the cowboy, who evolved from the Mexican vaquero and became, of course, a national symbol of the US in the late 19th century, the charro, with his, I haven't gone into it, but I want to at least briefly mention it, with the really multiple origins, Arab origins in a lot of the horse culture actually, of course the Spanish influence and also the influence, indigenous influence that was very strong, and even a lot of words stem from the Nahuatl from the Aztecs, and also some of the other cultural expressions are actually stem from indigenous traditions, by the way. And the charro, with its multiple Arab, Spanish, and Amerindian origins, also turned into a national figure in the 1920s. And although the figures of the charro and the cowboy result from intercultural mixture, which originated in the history of colonialism, both have been traditionalized as essential epitome of Mexican and US cultural identity, respectively. And they were both cleansed from the traces of otherness. That's the main point, too. Although this does not hold true for all the cultural productions, I said, and I really want to repeat this because it's a very important point, that these genres are actually sites of contestation. So the genres as a site of cultural contestation, and there are, of course, different representations that don't all belong to this sort of cleansing of the traces of otherness. And I will give you a few examples shortly. And rather than displaying these intercultural connections, differences between Mexican and US American cultural identities were commonly emphasized. In the Western and in the Comedia Ranchera, that use the other culture to foreground their own national identity in these national identity constructions. And both genres have aptly been called, you might have heard this, it's a very famous phrase by André Bazin, one of the main film theoricians in the Cahiers du Cinéma background, who called the Western the American cinema par excellence. So this is quite apt, this characterization. I already mentioned Jorge Ayala Blanco, who correspondingly called the Comedia Ranchera el cine mexicano por excelencia, the Mexican cinema par excellence. And as would come prevalent in, are there any questions at this point? I mean, we don't really have to follow this line so much. I mean, if there are any interest in some of the points I've made, or if there are any questions, we can follow these lines as well. All right, that's a good idea, so I will. As would become prevalent in the classical Hollywood Western, early US American films already construct Manichean oppositions between the cowboy as hero and the Mexican villain, stigmatized by the stereotype of the greaser, a derogative term commonly used by US soldiers in the Mexican-American War. In this construction of Hispanic alterity, Mexicans are depicted as lazy and thieving, a stereotype that persisted in numerous films, already evident in many film titles, as, for example, The Greaser's Gauntlet by the big classic D.W. Griffith, by the way, or Bronco Billy and the Greaser by Bronco Billy Anderson himself. And these are films in the beginning of the 10s, so these are early film productions. And Mexican film productions, and nonetheless, Hollywood eventually changed the overtly discriminating depiction of Mexicans to improve film distribution in Mexico and Latin America. Of course, there were also and primarily economic interests involved in cultural productions like film. This is quite evident because they're very capital-intensive productions. And subsequently, this is very interesting, so there's the cultural reaction, so to say, to these economically driven reasons. Subsequently, Mexican film productions, which originally in the beginning of the 20th century were more oriented towards European cinema, which of course dominated world market. Hollywood did not back then, began to increasingly take up and alter the genre patterns of the Western, which initially actually represented Mexicans in such a negative way. And I want to show you a little example here, so this might give you a little break too of all these informations, and a little clip I want to show you. It's a film called La Marca del Cuervo, The Mark of the Raven, and could you maybe help me with the, or I can, actually I'm not so sure where it is. Probably will find it anyways. No. La Marca del Cuervo, could you assist me, maybe? That'd be cool. Good. And this is one of the films that actually, this is a film from the 50s. I mean, there are many examples, and there's a vast production of the Commedia Ranchera, but this is one example where the hybridization of Western genre is particularly pronounced, and where there's even ironic, a playing even, so to say, with certain stereotypes of cowboys and Indians. And so have a look at this little clip here, which is the beginning of the film. And I might already, while we're getting things ready here, explain to you that the Filmex was one of the big studios of Mexican cinema, of course. And it's very interesting that the beginning, you will see this, the logo of Filmex is a spinning globe. And this spinning globe, of course, evokes very strongly the logo of Universal Pictures. You all know Universal Pictures with a spinning globe, which is really an icon of cinematic productions and of Hollywood cinema, basically also showing the global reach. It actually has to be loud. It's important. This is a lot about music, too. Thank you. Some of the interpretations here, but we still will watch the end of this little beginning of the film because I think some people see it right now because there's a little joke here which I've already mentioned now, but what is evident here already is that the beginning of the sequence draws heavily to the semantic of the Western genre, and at the same time it's quite exaggerated. There's no action to it, there's no little narrative to it, but it's just a performance itself, and just the very skilled domination of the horse and very playful, to the Saderia, which is the national sport of Mexico, all has to do with game and all has to do with domination of horses, of course. And then there comes in from this dramatic sound, which could be the sound of a Mexican, of a Western, a U.S. Western. Then there comes in this very typical ranchera music with the typical grito mexicano, the very high-pitched voice, which is usually associated also with mariachi groups. And then, of course, you have the big star here who sings, and he is actually in the double role of the masked hero here. And there are some aspects also of the masked hero serials, with the difference that here the black clothing, which usually in the Western depicts that this is the villain, here on the contrary, he is the hero in black, also because the charro figure is actually vested in black garments. And of course, Antonio Aguilar here, he was called El Charro de Mexico, the Mexican charro, and he's one of the main singer, actor, stars, and a strong symbol of Mexicanidad. And of course, already when the name comes there and the singing, his voice is being, of course, by the viewers is being recognized as such. This is all very positively connotated. And this is a very typical scene, of course, too, which is very characteristic for the musical component of the Commedia Ranchera, which, as I said, has, in a way, its equivalent in the singing cowboy films. And there are a lot of convergencies between these two subgenres. And, but I'm not going to dwell into it. But now we're going to see a little joke on a meta-reflection, if you want, on the Western genre and its adaptation and hybridization in Mexican cinema, in the Commedia Ranchera, which actually is a genre that on one hand draws very strongly, especially to the semantics of the Western genre, and on the other hand really draws closely to very cultural specific expressions of the culture of the charro. And this is the little scene we have. Okay. So we do have here the Indians playing cowboys and Indians, and significantly the Indians beating up the cowboy. This is a little joke, a little remark, a meta, if you want, so commentary on the appropriation of the generic patterns in a way. And there are actually other films in, especially the late 50s and 60s, they are much more in the vein of hybridizing, and they're actually drawing to a lot of different and often not at the first sight seem to be compatible genres, such as sci-fi and horror films that all come into the Commedia Ranchera. So there's a strong hybridization going on, and this would be a different, interesting topic to speak about, but of course we're not going to dwell into this here. And besides all these, how are we about time? Just Good. I had a lot of other things, but since we had it more in a dialogical way, there were some questions. We might as well finish at this part. So we've seen that these hybridizations are quite strong, and I would be glad if there are any questions or remarks. Yes?
You mentioned earlier, you started talking about,
Sorry, you were mentioning briefly the role of the presence of women in the singing cowboys genre in the U.S. I wonder, what is the role, if any, of women in Commedia Ranchera? Is it comparable to the non-existing role in the Western, or what is it?
Mm-hmm. Well, when women are really confined to the, and this is very important, in the generic structures of the melodramatic mode. And women, they really are passive in a very strong sense. I mean, they do play roles as protagonists as well. They're the beautiful women who usually doesn't speak much either and who suffers a lot. This is in a lot of the main stars, and an example would be, for example, also Amanda Ledesma, who came from Argentina, and who also, because there is a very similar pattern there, because actually all of these, so I want to extend your question a little bit, all of these Latin American film musicals, they have very repressive representation of women, actually. And it's not just a coincidence that Amanda Ledesma, who came to star in a lot of Mexican productions and also comedias rancheras, that she also is one of the suffering women. So the type of the suffering woman is actually the main role of the woman. What is interesting, though, that at the same time, I didn't dwell into this. There's another genre which is the cabaret, cabareteras, the cabaret films, and there it's a different imaginary of the woman who is more active, actually, who has a lot more in the generic structures in the narrative, a lot more abilities to actually act, but she's really stigmatized, and she's a woman who expresses her sexuality. And what is interesting, these films are set in the city, whereas the comedia ranchera, they're all set at the hacienda, and the hacienda is like an allegory for the nucleus of the nation, and it's really intact. And also the social configuration, actually it's a very conservative, if not reactionary genre, because also the peasants are really in a hierarchical order to the upper class charro. So they're really, in terms of class, and also class and gender, and also in terms of race, because indigenous people, they only function as emblems of Mexicanidad, but they don't have any agency in these films. So significantly, a lot of films, they show indigenous people in some of the typical iconographies you find also in the muralistas, and also in Eisenstein in Que Viva Mexico was very influential, but they don't speak. They actually only are there physically. So this is quite interesting. So in terms of race, class, gender, and even in terms of regional belonging, there's a lot of exclusions going on. And in terms of regional belongings, because of course Mexico is one of the countries with the most complex and most varied cultural expressions, but of course the comedia ranchera, this is all based on the culture of Jalisco and Guerrero and some of the other close-by states, and these are just some very particular forms of cultural expressions which have been traditionalized as Mexican cultural identity, but there's a lot of exclusions going on. So in terms of the women, this is very strong, and it is also true, of course, for all the Latin American musicals. And even if you look at most Hollywood productions, it's quite similar too. Especially if the women are actually embodied by Latin Americans, like Carmen Miranda, for example. She basically doesn't speak. There are basically hardly any dialogues, and if there are dialogues, it's just some absurd stuff she says. She just sings and expresses her sexualized body. And this holds true for a lot of other female actor-singers too. So thank you very much for the question.
Okay, and then we come back here.
You mentioned something about hybridization, and I wasn't really clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
I would like more explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's basically a metaphor for the mixing of culture, and it has become actually one of the key metaphors in cultural and post-colonial studies, but actually the term is quite problematic because the term actually stems from, it has some racist connotations because the hybridization was considered to be a mixture of different races of horses especially in the 19th century. It was used in social Darwinist thought. And then later on, it has been re-semanticized by mainly leftist thinkers who used the metaphor to express rather subversive forms of cultural mixture, to put it in a nutshell. And of course, one of the main and one of the first theoricians is Bakhtin, who actually, and this is very interesting, who actually differentiated between different forms of hybridization. And he said that the hybridization, and this is much in line also with what Edward Said said, that all cultures are interrelated, and he says that too. And he says there's basically two different forms of hybridization. One is the actual hybridization, the other one is the conscious hybridization, which is consciously employed and which he considers as something to be subversive. And he theorized this in regard to the novel, in regard to Dostoevsky, for example, and he theorized it how different forms of speaking, social, who belong to different social spheres, how they encounter even within one sentence and how they multiply language and how they breaking the borders of normative social structures that are manifest in language, in written language, and especially in here, of course, in fiction, in Bakhtin. And then it was theorized prominently by Homi Bhabha, the Indian post-colonial theorist. And also there is a strong critic, Spivak you mentioned, for example. She vehemently criticized the notion, or the usage rather, of hybridity, and he argues against something she calls a triumphalist approach to hybridization, because it's all very affirmative, and I think that sometimes there's a prolonging of something that in aesthetical productions and cultural productions reflects on hybridization, and this is also prolonged to the social sphere, often in a reading of these texts that are really devoid of any context. So this is actually, I mean, I didn't go into it here, and maybe I should have even used the different terms, so thank you very much for the question. It is rather problematic. And then again, there are other terms like métissage, for example, which is used in the Caribbean and which is a very good term, actually, which might be, but also, I mean, a lot of these metaphors, they have other origins, but still they can be re-semanticized. So it's basically about defining the certain usage of the term, I would suppose. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I had a question, sorry. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you if you can explain a little bit more the role of this type of movies in promoting a national identity abroad, a cultural identity towards other nations, and because it seems to be creating a sort of stereotype, what other cinematic genres or other tools were used to complete maybe the image that one could get from this type of movie?
Thank you. That's a very interesting, very important question also. There is one of the main scholars of Latin American cinema, Ana Lopez, and she's a specialist actually on Mexican cinema, and she put a phrase which I think really clearly puts it how Mexican cinema worked in terms of its pan-Latin American reach, because she said it was a nationalist genre that nonetheless created a continental voice. And I think that this ambiguity is quite telling, and it has a lot to do also with drawing to these rural traditions, because of course in the early 30s there was a lot of modernization processes going on in Latin America, and this has been of course theorized by different sociologists who characterize the Latin American modernity as something very complex. Garcia Canclini, the Argentinian who came to Mexico to become one of the most prominent theoricians on cultural theory, and it's always anthropologically grounded, he termed the phrase of the multitemporal modernity. And actually, this is quite one of the main specificities, And also other theoricians have, like Joaquin Brunner from Chile, have theorized this kind of modernity that includes pre-modern and something that even almost in advance has effects that like post-modern. So different times are kind of put together in this very complex form of modernization and modernity in Latin America that does not at all correspond with the rather progressivist notion in Western theorizing, which is basically like this timeline and progressing always. So what I wanted to say with this is that Latin American modernity or modernization processes were really very ambivalent and in a situation where there was a strong rural community still, but life was being mediatized already, and so all these different also complementaries, they were actually acted out in these genres. And I think this is why this nucleus of the nation, which is really conservative and which is really rural, appealed so much to the Latin American audience. And also the function of music is very central, because these musical singer stars, they were actually stars in all Latin America. Like Jorge Negrete, Antonio Aguilar, all these, they were really very, very big stars. They were even really big stars in Spain and also in the US, of course, especially with the Hispanic communities, but not only with the Hispanic communities. It's interesting that even there's a lot of taking up of these Mexican heritage, musical heritage, even in US cinema. A lot of singing Western films, actually, they even have songs in Spanish, and they take up some of the generic elements of the Comedia Ranchera. This would be another theme to go into, but this is very interesting. So it was also the figure, the star figure, the singing actor star figure that, and this is the cross-media component to it too, that helped to really spread these genre productions. That's good. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and thank you. Nada, nada. Sí, sí, voy a tomar un café.